we are going to do things slightly different this time around. The one dominant story is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And joining us for this conversation is Bruce Spector, Daily Maverick Associate Editor. And we're also joined by Dr. David Monyae. He is the Associate Professor in Political Science and International Relations. And he is also the Director of the Center for Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Gentlemen, to the both of you, thank you very much for making the time. Can I quickly start with you, Brooks, and latching on to the latest information we are hearing, and that is that President Putin has called for his so-called deterrence force, and this is a force that has in it units which include nuclear arms to be placed on high alert. My question to you, and I'm going to ask the same question of Dr. Monyae, is whether or not the Russian leader is capable of pressing the nuclear button, given that the reports were on Thursday night already that the Russian forces had gained control of the Chernobyl plant, nuclear plant.
Well, good afternoon. Let's take your question and break it into a couple of parts. Obviously, a national leader whose military force includes nuclear weapons is presumed to be in extremis, presumed to be capable of using them through whatever command and control mechanisms are set out in that country. The question is whether they would choose to use them, or whether they would, as is apparently true in this case, has chosen to use the threat of thinking about using them as a sufficient threat to encourage a different outcome. He didn't, as far as I can understand what was said, he didn't say they are on a higher alert and ready to be used, and he didn't specify which kinds and which targets and whether they were in Europe or the United States. But it is unusual, not unique, but unusual for a national leader with a military that includes nuclear capabilities to move up the ladder of readiness in national or perceived national emergencies. I'm trying to be very careful because there's a whole literature based around how and why and when nuclear deterrence is invoked and in what circumstances. Having said all that, the fact that he would choose to make that pronouncement in what is up until now, by his words, presumed to be something much less than an invasion, let alone a conflict, is worrying. And it's worrying because it is an effort to enlarge the circle of engagement, whether the threat is directed at Western Europe or Canada, the United States, Britain, wherever it might be. It is a very much more concerning threat than it would have been to simply say we are worried about X and Y and Z. The final point, of course, is you mentioned Chernobyl. The problem is not that Chernobyl has fissile nuclear materials that could be used as weapons, as much as because the containment at Chernobyl from the earlier explosion is not entirely stable. There is the implicit threat in there somehow, in some way, that forces could take the option of reopening that containment field, as horrible as that sounds, to cause nuclear pollution, contamination across wide swathes of territory. That is something that I don't think anybody has really countenanced up until now.
Dr. Monyae, let's bring you in. The Russian president, he was quoted as saying, if you are thinking of, if there's any thinking of outside interference, his words were, and I quote, consequences greater than any you have faced in history will be visited upon you. What do you make of that statement particularly given what is being said now?
There are a number of factors that are at play. I think the very first one that we need to just state that President Putin is not Saddam Hussein. He is not Muammar Gaddafi. He is a serious head of state that commands more than 6,000 nuclear warheads. That single-handedly, he has a potential of ending the current civilization. And therefore, he has to be taken serious. I think that's the very first point. The second is that this crisis is much more deeper than what we are hearing. It signals the end of your post-Cold War era, a U.S.-led unilateral power. And all wars since the end of Cold War has been U.S.-led. When you look at Syria, Iraq, Libya, and all other destabilization in the world, has always been the United States using massive power. And this time around, we see another power also challenging, using more or less same pattern, hegemonic maximum use of hardcore power. And therefore, that tells us something, that we're entering into a new era, that there will be multiplicity of centers of power. Yeah. And therefore, this requires us to think seriously, firstly, to transform the institutions of global governance, particularly the United Nations Security Council. And we in Africa, I think our voice needs to be heard and to be also taken serious. And we also should be worried that as much as sanctions are being imposed on Russia and all latest and excitement around the so-called SWIFT option, these factors also can boomerang in the sense that we have digital currencies, that Russia has the ability to utilize the digital currency, whether it's in trade with China, rendering the entire SWIFT system useless. And therefore, we're really entering new area, new era, where technology is being used and the manner in which weaponry that is being deployed. And we should expect more bloodshed in the next 48 to 72 hours.
Wow, my goodness. Brooks, let's come quickly to you, and you're probably going to have to say your final words here. Let's bring the conversation closer to home. Dr. Monyae has already alluded to it. How loud and clear has the voice of African leaders been? And do you understand where they stand?
How loud and clear have African leaders been on this crisis so far?
Yeah.
I would argue that for the most part, they have been relatively unclear and very quiet. And that, in effect, is a shame. The original statement from the Department of International Relations and Cooperation in this country was, let me use the blunt word here, it was mushy. It basically said everybody should get along and be nice. The second statement was much clearer, and it said, we support sovereignty of nations and we do not believe that countries should invade other countries, or words to that effect, and that there should be mechanisms to get back to the beginning of things rather than where we apparently were headed. Whether or not African states, all 50 plus of them, can have any influence on this is a question. But there are mechanisms, and David did allude to one of them, of course, which is the United Nations. If votes within the General Assembly were to carry a united listing from African nations that this kind of effort to settle a dispute cannot stand, that might have some impact. Although the Russians, and in the case of Vladimir Putin in particular, appear to have a motivation that transcends any other mechanism and any other words by other people.
Yeah.
And I actually don't know how much weight African nations can bring to bear on this question.
All right.
I will take issue with one thing that David alluded to,
Yeah.
which is that there's all kinds of mechanisms for greater difficulties and problems electronically. It's absolutely true that that's the case, but if that happens, you can point to those who carry them out as the cause of that problem. We've already seen several efforts to destroy web servicing in Ukraine, presumably by Russian actors, although no one knows for sure. And then we saw several against Russian government websites. Again, no one knows precisely who caused those.
Yeah.
The question that most people should worry about is the electronic infrastructure that ties all of us together, whether it is through banking or within our own countries, the control of electrical grids, water, and communication. And if that comes unraveled, then we are indeed headed to a dark place.
All right. Dr. Monyae, you get to have the last word, and the question is quite similar. The voice of African leaders in this conflict, how loud and clear has it been, and how weighty, by the way, is it in the United Nations Security Council?
All this is taking place at a time when the African voice has drastically weakened. I think we have seen the last year or so, there's been almost 6 military coups on the African continent, including our political headquarters, Ethiopia, that is in a crisis. And we also look at the kind of leadership we have at this moment in time. It appears that the continent, one, is not speaking with one voice. And number 2 is that the continent tend to look and follow a Western propaganda, Western view on issues. As we speak, there are bombings on the African continent, in Somalia, in so many places. But our focus is on Ukraine. As important as it is, there are so many conflicts on our own continent. And therefore, I think it's high time that we look at the situation in the world, strengthen the African agenda, speak with one voice, and coming home, the statement that was made by the President, Ramaphosa, is very clear. We are not taking sides, and we should not take sides. We strongly believe in the negotiations, mediation. I think that's the strongest. We have no right to call upon Russians to leave Ukraine or any other part for that matter. But we need to encourage both parties to negotiate as the only way. And if we look strongly, that's the only way. In the end, it will be negotiation. It won't be the question of President Putin being victorious or Western-dominated, Western-inspired Ukrainian government winning either. And therefore, why do we have to go on a mass damage to infrastructure, human lives, and all that comes with that, which has a direct implication on our economy?
Dr. David Monyae, thank you very much. And Bruce Spector, thank you also for your contribution to this conversation.